All right, we're going to start. So welcome to our How to Read Hosea webinar. And the reason I wanted to do this, for those who might be new to our church, over the last few years, every time we do kind of a major series on a new book of the Bible, I've been trying to have a seminar or webinar that helps introduce it and give you some more handholds to it to help move us away from a way of reading the Bible where we just get bits and pieces or passages here and there, and you have a sense of the whole and kind of the bigger theology, and also just as a way to recognize these are ancient texts. These aren't modern texts, and they have their different ways of communicating and making meaning. And so to give us some tools to engage that. But something I was reflecting on as I was driving here tonight is, other than the book of Jonah, which is very narrative driven, in 7 or 8 years of pastoring this church, never done a series on really any of the a whole series on a book of the prophetic book, especially the minor prophets. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is they're not narratives. And if you read through many of these books, it just feels like there's just a lot of stuff going on, and it's not linear. And it's kind of unclear how to put it all together or what it means. And so we can kind of pull out some nuggets here and there, maybe some nice verses, but what is the overall message, how to make meaning of it? What's the story? It can be kind of hard to follow and confusing. So we're going to try to break that trend by this fall jumping into the book of Hosea, which is at the start of what's called the minor prophets. So I'm going to give a little introduction to first the minor prophets, okay? Let's see here. So the minor prophets are 12 books, and in the Christian canon, Christian scriptures, they're the final 12 books of the Old Testament. Now, they're actually not always called the minor prophets. That name was given to them by Saint Augustine, I think around the 4th or 5th century. That's a little picture of Augustine. And he called them the minor prophets because, hey, they're in the Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament, and they're all kind of shorter. They're much shorter than the big ones, the major prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. If you read those, some of them are like 60 chapters long, and these other books, these other 12 ones, are relatively short. And so he's like, let's call them the minor prophets. And so I don't know about you, but that's how I grew up hearing about them, that they're the minor prophets, and maybe less so in importance. And I didn't engage them very much, other than like reading through them when I was doing my Bible major in undergrad. But something I've learned is there's a lot more there. So while Augustine, not till the 4th or 5th century, labeled them the minor prophets, and that kind of stuck for Christians, in the Hebrew tradition, the Jewish tradition, they didn't call them the minor prophets. They called it the Book of 12. In fact, some, even before the time of Jesus, some thinkers back then would say, oh yeah, there's Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the Book of the 12. And so it's these 12 prophets, but they were almost considered one book, one entity. And many people think they were literally considered like put together on one big scroll. So why is that? Why are these 12 books actually considered together a book? And so there's a couple of different people have suggested theories of like what holds these 12 books together, other than the fact that they're just really short and come at the end. And one way to see kind of what connects them from Hosea down to Malachi is that they give kind of a historical chronology of the story of Israel from a prophetic perspective, from around the 8th, 9th century until the Israelites returned from exile. So if you kind of notice, the first 6 books, Hosea through Micah, the setting is mainly the northern kingdom. So this is when Israel is split between kind of Israel or Samaria in the north and Judah in the south. And the first 6 books are focused on the northern kingdom, and the major kind of political dynamic going on is Assyria is the big superpower to the east, threatening to take them over. And Israel's always trying to figure out, do we make an alliance from them? Do we need to make alliance against them? How do we relate to them? And all these prophets are speaking into that political dynamic. And if you remember kind of your history of Israel, it's Assyria comes and actually kind of conquers the north and exiles them in 722 BC. And then so after the north gets taken out of the picture by Assyria, the next three books are all focused on Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah, all focus on the southern kingdom. And they have a new threat, which is Babylon. So this is more the 7th and 6th centuries now, these prophetic texts. And they're now worried about Babylon and how do we relate to them, and how do we survive as Judah, and where is God in this? And so those prophets speak to that situation, the threat of Babylon. Then famously, Babylon comes and lays siege to Jerusalem and takes them into exile in 586 BC. And then the last three prophets in the book of 12, in the book of 12, don't get any prophets speaking while they're in exile. These last ones are speaking from the perspective of when the Israelites have started to come back from exile and get resettled in the land, and where is God, and what's our hope, and what do we long for, and what is God promising? And so the last three, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, are speaking to kind of this hope of restoration now that the people have gotten back from exile. So one way people say, well, what's the reason for this book of 12 put together? It's a prophetic take on the history of the divided kingdom, the exile, and their return, that kind of back half of Israel's history. So there's kind of a historical ordering to the books on one perspective. But others have said, well, that's okay, that's nice. But some have said there's something deeper connecting these books. There's actually a literary unity to the book of 12, that they're kind of tied together. Any of you guys familiar with a daisy chain, right? Where you take like a daisy and then the bottom of the stem of one, you tie to the top of the other one, and so on. And you can kind of wrap them around and make a little crown, or just a nice little like chain of daisies. And some people think there's actually, these 12 books are kind of like a big daisy chain of meaning. And I'm going to show you a slide. You might have to kind of look closely to see all the details. But this one particular scholar, what he's looked at is, at the end of each book, there's a few key words that in the next book, in the book of 12, seems to pick up those same kind of themes, or almost link words that kind of tie it together and notch one text to the other. And that you can trace that, or he has this way of tracing that, all the way through the 12 books, kind of being tied together, one ending kind of fitting in and linking with some key words and themes to the start of the next, which I think is a really fascinating thing. So if you look, for example, what he says here in Hosea, and he might be doing he's actually referring to Hosea 14, 7. And so Hosea, this is almost one of the final verses of the book of Hosea. It says, people, in my translation, will dwell again in his shade. They will flourish like the grain. They will blossom like the vine. Israel's fame will be like the wine of Lebanon. And so we got people, some translations, it's like people who dwell in the land, and mentions of wine and vines, okay? Well, if you flip the page to Joel and you start reading through Joel, it's a change of tone. It's kind of a more ominous text, but we hear some of these words. It says, listen, all who live in the land. And the Hebrew is actually very similar to kind of talking about the inhabitants, or people who are dwelling in the land. In verse 5, wail, all you drinkers of wine, wail because of the new wine, for it's been snatched from your lips. And then in verse 7, it has laid waste my vines and ruined my fig trees. And so there's kind of some similar imagery and words in the Hebrew that are at the ending of one and come up at the end of the next. And this kind of graph, you can go and kind of play with this later, shows how in some ways the 12 are all kind of daisy chained together all throughout, kind of creating this nice link there. And I can send this out later because I know this is a lot of information, but so I think that's a really cool way to think about its unity of like, at some point, these different prophetic texts were there, and the Hebrew community that was kind of forming their canon found kind of a way to knit these together in a way that's really meaningful. Okay, so that's one way to see their literary unity. Some see kind of a thematic unity that you can trace almost like a narrative arc to them. So another scholar says, well, hey, while all of these books deal with sin and judgment and hope of restoration, there's also kind of a focus to each section. And so he sees in the first 6 books really building God's case against the Israelites' iniquity and their sin. And so it's kind of an indictment. And in a lot of those first books, there's a lot of lawsuit language where God's almost kind of the prosecutor of Israel and kind of building a case and evidence against them for how they've been unfaithful to God's covenant. And this scholar says, and then in that second half, or in that second set, there's a focus on judgment. This is what's going to happen in light of that because of your sin. Here's the just consequences. But then the third one's turning towards a theme of future restoration. Now, again, if you read any of these books, you'll see these notes in all of them. But this kind of scholar is saying, hey, there's this bigger narrative arc that's kind of working through the book of 12 that's trying to tell a story of sin, judgment, and restoration. So again, that's another really interesting way to see them. And so historically, kind of in terms of chronology, in terms of how they're literarily connected and overarching themes, people see a lot of reasons why it makes sense that we should consider these 12 books as kind of a soundtrack that tells a story that should be put together. But if you do that, if you consider it as kind of one unit as the book of 12, what that means is Hosea is the opening and Malachi is kind of the conclusion. And what's interesting about that as kind of the bookends, the 2 bookends for the book of 12, is that if you read Hosea and then read Malachi, you'll notice some really interesting themes that kind of are very prominent in this bookend. As we're going to see in Hosea, the primary metaphor, the major theme, is this metaphor of marriage, and it's about covenant faithfulness between God and Israel and dealing with unfaithfulness. There's also a minor or sub-theme we're going to see in the book of Hosea of kind of a parent-child relationship, and Israel's kind of a rebellious child, and will this parent welcome Israel back and show mercy? Those are the major themes in Hosea. But if you flip, keep a hand in Hosea, but if you flip to the very end of the entire Old Testament, the very end of the book of 12, to Malachi, some of the biggest themes are, it's all about breaking covenant. There's a famous divorce passage in Malachi, which is kind of theme for another conversation, but there's issues of, we're dealing with covenant unfaithfulness, marital unfaithfulness, and where does Malachi end? The very end of the Old Testament. I'm going to send the prophet Elijah to you before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the hearts of their children to the parents, or else I will come and strike the land with total destruction. There's an ominous note, but some sort of promise of turning of parents' hearts and children's hearts towards one another. And so the book of 12, in a way, if you see Hosea and Malachi, is kind of creating the bookends and opening and ending with these key themes of like marriage between God and Israel, a parental relationship between a beloved child and all the rockiness of it, these are the key themes that the book of 12 is inviting us to interpret this history of Israel through. And I think that's really cool, because if that is kind of how the Hebrew scriptures land, well, what are some of the biggest themes in the New Testament? Jesus is presented, Jesus and the church's relationship is presented as a marriage relationship. And the church is the bride of Christ. And so there's a sense that sets us up for Jesus and parent-child, right? Jesus kind of fulfills or restores that broken parent-child relationship as he turns to the Father and is faithful to the Father and is welcomed back into his arms. So anyways, big themes that are set up by these bookends. And many people think in Hosea, starting with Hosea, it's really the first place where the marriage relationship between God and Israel becomes kind of on full display in the Hebrew scriptures. All right, so that's kind of the book of 12, some stuff that's going on there thematically. But now I want to kind of dive into Hosea. And based upon our kind of quick overview of the book of 12, a lot of scholars, including this one I quote here, Bo Lim, he says it functions hermeneutically. So it's kind of like hermeneutics is how we interpret. Hosea functions hermeneutically and theologically as an introduction to the 12 prophets. So this Hosea, if we want to get a good sense of what the book of 12 is about, Hosea is going to do a lot of that work for us and help us get into it. So that's why it's a great book to study and will help us with all these other books here. So the rest of the time tonight, we're going to kind of look at how Hosea does some of that stuff. But I want to set up the historical context. Look at Hosea chapter 1 here. It says, the word of the Lord, this is verse 1, the word of the Lord that came to Hosea, son of Beeri, during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. So that's what's going down in the south, all these different kings. And that's less of the focus. And it's during the reign of Jeroboam, son of Jehoash, king of Israel. So Jeroboam is the king of Israel. And there's two Jeroboams. If you remember our study of kings, there's Jeroboam the first, not a good king. There's also Jeroboam the second. And so the context when Hosea steps on the scene, when the word of the Lord comes to him, is the reign of Jeroboam the second. Well, we have a little bit in our Bible that tells us about what the reign of Jeroboam the second was. In 2 Kings 14, verses 23 to 29. So again, keep a finger in Hosea and try flipping over to 2 Kings 14. And we get this quick account, 7-verse account of Jeroboam the second. And we see in verse 23, he became king in Samaria, and he reigned 41 years, which, if you know kings, that's actually a really long reign, okay? That's a long life back then, 41 years. Now, Kings, if you remember from our study of Kings, is written after the exile to explain what went wrong. So it's actually written much later after Hosea, and so it's with theological commentary on the history. And so we get that here. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord and did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam. That's kind of his great whatever grandfather, which he had caused Israel to commit. Okay, so we get some commentary that after the fact that he's supposed to be evil. But look what actually happens during Jeroboam II's reign. He was the one who restored the boundaries of Israel from Labo Hamath to the Dead Sea in accordance with the word of the Lord spoken through his servant Jonah, a prophet from Gath Hepher. And the Lord had now seen how bitterly everyone in Israel, whether slave or free, was suffering. There was no one to help them. And since the Lord had said he wouldn't blot out the name of Israel from under heaven, he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam. And as for the other events of Jeroboam's reign, all he did in his military achievements, including how he recovered for Israel both Damascus and Hamath, which had belonged to Judah, aren't they written in the books of the annals of the king of Israel? So if you take out that much later commentary from the author of Kings about how he was evil, and you were just living in that time, experiencing Jeroboam II's reign, you'd probably perceive him as a really good king, and things are flourishing. He's restoring the boundaries. He's taken some land back from the south. God's using him to deliver from enemies. He has lots of military achievements. This is like a successful leader. Things are going relatively well under Jeroboam II, kind of from a historical perspective, maybe not from a spiritual perspective. And so Hosea is coming on the scene. God's word's coming to Hosea at a time where people might actually not have a self-awareness of, we're struggling, we're broken, we're dealing with sin. They might be coming from a perspective of, life's pretty going good. This is going well. This is working out. And so Hosea is going to show up with kind of a countercultural word to what the people are experiencing in terms of the kingdom thriving. And it's going to say, hey, the car seems like it's running good, but I'm gonna invite you to look under the hood and see what's really going on here. And so that's what Hosea is kind of starting to do. He's starting to say, hey, things are actually not as good as they seem. There's some rot here. So that's kind of the context of when Hosea first starts. And so his reign, again, is 40 years. So some people think Hosea's kind of stretches from 790 to 750 BCE. There's some reference in later Hosea to changes of kings. And after Jeroboam II, there's a number of kings changing. So he might even stretch a little past Jeroboam as well. And starting to reveal and deal with kind of the discord and spiritual unhealth of Israel. Okay, so that's the historical context. So how does Hosea introduce this stuff and address the people of Israel? I want to kind of help you kind of get some handholds on how this book functions and holds together and its structure in terms of how it functions as a prophetic text. So let's look at the literary structure first. I said before that Hosea functions as kind of the introduction to the book of 12. And the book of 12 has like a general three big themes of naming Israel's sin, there's judgment for it, and then a promise of restoration or some kind of restoration. And all three of these themes occur in cycles within Hosea, in recurring cycles. So we see them. In fact, if you look at the text, if you kind of treat sin and its judgment together, you see at least 6 recurring of these cycles of sin, judgment on sin and restoration. And they just kind of keep repeating all throughout the book. So the book is not moving from like, here's the problem, and by chapter 14, it's going to be solved. It's moving in recurring cycles that keep cycling around to the same themes through different imagery, different angles. So it's not a great start to finish book. You need to learn to read it for the cycles and appreciate the cycles. And then notice when one cycle's ending, okay, maybe another one is actually starting here. And all of those cycles are giving us different angles windows into those core themes of judgment of sin and restoration. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So it's a cyclical book, not a linear book. So there's at least 6 clear cycles, and once you see this, you'll start to notice them in your reading. That being said, there's 3 kind of major sections or cycles, chapters 1 through 3, that really kind of hone into like Hosea and Gomer and this marriage between them. 4 through 11 that kind of goes through that cycle on like a big scale with kind of some mini cycles in it, and then chapters 12 through 14. And so scholars see those as kind of if they have to divide up the structure of Hosea, that's how they do it. So just another kind of way to think about it and pay attention to how the text is divided up and how to make sense of it. All right. Another way to think of each of those 3 big sections or cycles is that all 3 in the course of that cycle of those chapters, there's kind of a journey home, and there's a strong theme of Israel, whether it's framed as a wayward child or a wayward spouse. There's an issue of unfaithfulness and a kind of barrenness. And through the course of the few chapters, there's a return, there's an alienation and then a return home through God's mercy. And that results in children, in fertility, in fruitfulness. And so this becomes kind of a basic, a kind of narrative structure cycle that we see throughout the text in those three different sections, kind of a journey back home from barrenness to fertility, from unfaithfulness to renewal and mercy. So look for those kind of journeys home throughout the text. All right. And so each major cycle ends with a promise of renewal. And there's a real beauty to it. And I want you to appreciate those and not get lost in all the just onslaught of different poetic images and stuff going over it. So if you look at Hosea 1 through 3, that section ends 3:5. Afterwards, the Israelites will return and seek the Lord their God, and David, their king. They will come trembling to the Lord and to his blessings in the last day. And so it ends, that first cycle ends on just a wonderful sense of hope and renewal and blessing and return home. Then if you look at chapter 4, we're back to kind of the bad news, the charge against Israel. And chapter 5, judgment, and it goes through, and there's a lot of that stuff for a lot of chapters. But then by the time you get to 11, it cycles back to a promise of renewal and return. And so chapter 11, it kind of ends with God saying, how can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? My heart is changed within me. All my compassion is aroused. I will not carry out my fierce anger, nor will I devastate Ephraim again, for I am God. I'm not like a human being, the Holy One among you. I will not come against their cities, and they will follow the Lord. He will roar like a lion, and when he roars, his children will come trembling from the west, and they will come trembling like birds from Egypt, like doves from Assyria, and I'll settle them in their homes, declares the Lord. So beautiful vision of renewal ends kind of the big cycle that starts back in chapter 4. And then chapter 12, we're back to sin. And so again, if you're trying to read this linear, like you're kind of like, what? I thought things got solved. Now we're back to sin. It's just the cycle again. And so chapter 12 introduces Israel's sin, and 13, God's anger and judgment against that sin. But where do we land in chapter 14? Return, Israel, to the Lord your God. Your sins have been your downfall. Take words with you and return to the Lord. Say to him, forgive us all our sins and receive us graciously, that we may offer the fruit of our lips. Skipping down to verse 4, I will heal their waywardness and love them freely, for my anger is turned away from them. I'll be like the dew to Israel. He will blossom like a lily, like a cedar of Lebanon. He'll send down his roots. His young shoots will grow. His splendor will be like an olive tree's fragrance, like a cedar of Lebanon. And people will dwell again in his shade. They'll flourish like the grain. They will blossom like the vine. Israel's fame will be like the wine of Lebanon. Ephraim, what more have I to do with idols? I will answer him and care for him. I am like a flourishing juniper, and your fruitfulness comes from me. Beautiful, rich imagery of renewal is the exclamation point, the punctuation point on each cycle. And Hosea keeps coming back and landing us right there. So I think those are supposed to be junipers in my background there on that slide. I Googled it, so I don't really know. Someone was nodding, so okay, I hope I got that right. All right, so that's the first big takeaway. When you're reading this, kind of all think about, I'm within some cycle here of sin judgment that's going to come around to renewal and God's promise. But within the text, in addition to having this cyclical structure built around those key themes, There's also a number of literary devices that Hosea uses to make meaning, the prophetic text uses to make meaning. And the first of these is what I want to call pliable metaphors, okay? Or metaphors that are able to function in a lot of different ways and do a lot of different things. And so I'm going to give you an example. So look at chapter 2, okay? And we get a theme throughout chapter 2 of kind of a desert or a wilderness as one of the images that Hosea, the prophet, that God's using through Hosea to make meaning here. And the first time we come across this theme is in verse 3, and it's kind of in a theme of the judgment. And so God's talking about Israel as the unfaithful spouse and says, I will make her like a desert or like a wilderness, turn her into a parched land and slay her with thirst. Okay, so here wilderness is an image of judgment, almost punishment of, right before it's talking about God almost kind of just leaving her, like I'm done with this marriage. So, and I'm going to send, you're out in the wilderness now, you're on your own. And so it's kind of a scary image and a darker image, wilderness, when we first meet it in chapter 2. But look at verse 14. After a lot of this judgment stuff, we hear, therefore, I am now going to allure her, Israel. I will lead her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. There in the wilderness, I will give her back her vineyards. She'll make the valley of Acre a door of hope. There in the wilderness, she will respond as in the days of her youth, as in the days she came up out of Egypt. And so wilderness is still functioning as a key metaphor here. But now, instead of the place of judgment and desertion, the wilderness is the place of renewal, where God's renewing God's covenant with Israel. And it's kind of this place of intimacy, an intimate meeting. And there's a kind of a evoking of back kind of when you wandered in the wilderness out of Egypt, and I came and I met you there. And so why I say these are pliable metaphors is we get this a lot in Hosea. Hosea will put a metaphor out there, and it means one thing in one part of the story, but then the metaphor will be echoed, but now it's doing different work. Here it's talking about judgment. Now it's talking about hope. And so in that metaphor of wilderness, if you just think of what does the image wilderness mean in Hosea, it's not one thing. In fact, rather, wilderness tells a story. It's a metaphor that's pregnant with meaning. And if you kind of walk with that and get into that image, it takes you from judgment into hope. And this happens a lot of times in Hosea. And so I want you to be on the lookout for it as you read Hosea. I'm going to give you another example. Turn to chapter 5. Let's see, chapter 5. Chapter 5, verse 10. So here we're in a part of the cycle that's kind of in the judgment part. And we get the image of water. Verse 10, Judah's leaders are like those who move boundary stones. I will pour out my wrath on them like a flood of water. And that's a hard image, like especially right now in our context, right? Just a flood of water that's destructive, that has wrath. And so water is an image of judgment right here. But if you keep reading along, you get into chapter 6, it's still part of the same cycle, and it switches towards kind of a renewal theme. And look at 6:3. Let us acknowledge the Lord. Let us press on to acknowledge him. As surely as the sun rises, he will appear. He will come to us like the winter rains, like the spring rains that water the earth. Now water, instead of being something that's flooding and destructive, all of a sudden the metaphor has like changed its tone. it's healing rains, spring rains that restore us and bring life. And so again, similar to wilderness, we get a metaphor that has more than one meanings. And if you kind of trace it from one use to the next, it tells a story of judgment to redemption, of brokenness to healing. And so this is a really cool way in which metaphor is working in a pretty complex, sophisticated way in Hosea. And you see it in lots of places. One of those kind of promises of renewal I read from you, I don't know if you remember, but there was an image of a lion calling and like the cubs come back trembling, but like for blessing. And it's a sense of like this protective, as a protective figure gathering its kind of cubs back. And so the lion's like this hopeful image of renewal. But here in chapter 5, just a little under the water one, verse 14, for I will be like a lion to Ephraim, like a great lion to Judah. I will tear them to pieces and go away. I will carry them off with no one to rescue them. Whoa, that is a ferocious lion you don't want to meet. And so images like metaphors like lion can be metaphors for different things. So this is just kind of a fascinating thing, like how the biblical text, the biblical poetry here in the prophet, these metaphors, they tell stories through them. So a lot of us as modern readers want to find just like a narrative thread that runs straight through from start to finish in the book. It's hard to find that in a cyclical book that's full of imagery, but these metaphors do a lot of that narrative work of telling the story within them. Another literary device, and we're going to build on what we just shared here, and this should be no surprise because I've mentioned it in every single webinar I've ever done. There's chiasms here. All right. A chiasm is the kind of structure you see right on the screen where there's kind of like, as the text moves forward, there's actually repeating elements that kind of zoom into a center. And so if you stay in that section, Hosea 5, end of 5 through 6 that we were just looking at, you actually find a chiasm built around some of these recurring metaphors. We were just talking about this in our men's Bible study, so apologies for anyone who's joining from that group and just got this the other morning. We get wrath poured out like water, so the image of water. Then right after it in verses 13, images of sickness and healing, like, oh man, we have a sickness, there's sores, we're turning to Assyria for healing, but they don't have the cure. This is not good. And then God's a lion to us who's going to rip us apart. And then we have an echo of all of those. In 6:1, there's a reference back to the lion. He's torn us to pieces, but he will heal us. Sickness and healing, 1 and 2, we get after he has injured us, but he will bind up our wounds. After 2 days, he'll revive us. On the 3rd day, he will restore us. And then, like we mentioned, it comes back to reviving like water, showers, spring rains. And so you get a chiasm. And so the chiasm then naturally says, okay, we're getting these looping images. What's at the center of it? Well, what's at the center of this transformation from experiencing God as wrathful water and we're overcome by our sickness and don't have a way to cure it, and God ripping us apart as a lion? How do we get from that to a lion who's now healing us and God's reviving our and kind of healing our wounds, and we're getting showers that are renewing us? What's at the heart of that? 6:1, come, let us return to the Lord. Right before that, they'll earnestly seek me. And so this beautiful chiasm that says, well, what's at the heart of this change in kind of God's posture, the flip of the metaphor? It's this invitation for us to return to God, because there's something more in God for us to receive there. There's mercy and there's renewal to find. So again, beautiful poetic stuff, literary stuff happening here that it's super easy to miss, but we can start noticing it when we start to see these echo phrases and recurrences. So anyways, I think that's pretty awesome. And some people see, no surprise, big chiasms throughout the whole book, but I just want to give you one example of them. All right, now I want to dig in a little bit. We kind of looked at examples of kind of smaller metaphors, a chiasm. This book is really built around two major metaphors. That of a marriage covenant, a husband-wife relationship where God is kind of figured as the husband and Israel as this kind of promiscuous or unfaithful wife, and also a parent-child relationship, kind of God as a father figure dealing with a rebellious child and trying to kind of negotiate that and work that out. And these are the two biggest recurring metaphors that kind of frame the whole book and are at the heart of it. Now, what I want you to see, because in a lot of our preaching and our study of Hosea, this is where a lot of the attention will go on these metaphors. And what I want you to see, and this is, I wish I was kind of a better scholar to talk about this, a better language to do it. But in the same way, like that metaphor of wilderness had a complexity to it. And so it could be an image that speaks to both God's judgment and God's renewal. And it could kind of contain those within its range of meaning, which help us to see God as one who has both judgment and renewal and mercy within God's own self. These metaphors of the marriage covenant, of the parent-child relationship, they're meant to have the same kind of pregnancy and richness and meaning that help us to say, hey, in this relationship with God, there's something about the anger at the brokenness of a covenant that like thinking about my relationship with God as a marriage and how angry and pained and grieved God is that I've broken that covenant. And because it's a marriage covenant, there is love. And so hope for renewal and commitment on God's part. And like this marriage covenant can be a metaphor, an image that helps us hold those things together in like a beautiful and creative tension. So that's what I want you to see, that these big metaphors, they help us hold together. The text is using them because they help us hold together the intense pain and consequences of rebellion and unfaithfulness. And with that, the enduring love that forgives and repairs broken relationships. And there's something about marriage or a parent-child relationship that can kind of hold within its experience that whole range of meaning. And so that's really important because Hosea is introducing, especially the marriage metaphor, it's kind of introducing that into the vocabulary of Israel. And it's going to be so at the heart of who Jesus is and where our kind of narrative as Christians go about our relationship with God. There's a marriage of heaven and earth, and God has redeemed us. We are the bride of Christ. And that is it's a choice to make that metaphor, right? If the text just used the image of God as a lawgiver or a judge, well, that's a great metaphor to use to communicate, judgment against sin, if God's like a judge. But if God is like a committed covenantal spouse, well, there's both, man, you betrayed me and I need to call you out, and like there's got to be consequences if this relationship's going to exist, but I love you and I'm in this and I covenanted to you. And so there's also hope. So marriage is this big complex metaphor that's going to hold those things together, and also that parent-child relationship. And that's why they're so precious and important and at the heart of this text. And it's also then what the big challenge of Hosea is making sense of these two core metaphors, especially the marriage one. And that's what a lot of our preaching is going to be about in this series. So let's dig into that piece a little bit. Oops, that's an empty slide. By getting into some issues in the text around this. So hopefully some of you got to read over, or you've read before, the first 3 chapters of Hosea, which are kind of the most famous parts, where we get this marriage stuff introduced. And in our Bible studies, we're going to kind of a deeper dive in all these texts. In some of the sermons, we're going to treat some of these in detail. But I don't know about you, but I kind of had this high level understanding of, there's something about, there's this woman Gomer, I don't know, she was like an adulteress or prostitute or something. Hosea is supposed to marry her. And that's kind of this analogy for God's love for Israel. And that's kind of what Hosea is about. The challenge is if you actually read the text closely, you get in those first 3 chapters, which are kind of each distinct in a way, you get 3 different episodes or that are similar but different. So in chapter 1, Hosea is called to marry this promiscuous woman named Gomer and have children with her. And that's kind of the plot of chapter 1, okay? In chapter 2, well, 1, it seems it's kind of less of a narrative text. It's more poetic. It doesn't mention Hosea, it doesn't mention Gomer. It seems to be talking more about God and Israel. But there's another plot line that continues around marriage. And here in chapter 2, it starts out with an apparent divorce or separation between husband and wife, followed by, in the second half of chapter 2, a renewal of the covenant and renewal of love for the children. Okay. And then if you go to chapter 3, you get another kind of episode about marriage. It's back to Hosea. And this time Hosea is called to, it says, show love to your wife again. But it doesn't use the name Gomer. And it says she's loved by another and she's an adulteress. And so it gives the image of Hosea needs to go love this wife who's actually seems to now be in another relationship and committing adultery, and has to kind of buy her back. And people are like, is this some sort of bride price, or is she working as a prostitute and he's actually just kind of paying her fee to kind of buy her out of that? We're not really sure. And so Hosea purchases her, and then they kind of are going to this time of abstinence, sexual abstinence from one another, which is kind of, again, a metaphor of purifying or resetting the relationship between God and Israel. What's challenging about this is what in the world is happening in this marriage, okay? So if you're trying to read this as one marriage, a lot of people have gotten kind of caught up trying to map out, okay, this must all be talking about Hosea and Gomer, and it's become this really complex story. So like, okay, she's sleeping around, he marries her, he has children with her, but then they divorce. Maybe there was renewal, I don't know, but then she somehow left him, and now she's committing adultery and loves another person. And for some reason, even though he already was married, but maybe they're divorced, now he's buying her back. And people come up with these complex theories to kind of reconstruct a backstory that creates some sort of coherent story between chapters 1 and through 3. And people kind of who really get inspired by that, like there's whole like Christian romance novels based on this. And like there was a whole movie now recently, I think, called Redeeming Love, that's based on like a really loose trying to reconstruct all the dynamics and back and forth of this relationship. And scholars have debates and like all these commentaries. Is the wife talked about, is Gomer in chapter 1 the same person talked about in chapter 3? There's debates about, do the children, if you read a lot of the different throughout Hosea, does he have children with Gomer? Or does she already have children? Is she pregnant from another marriage? There's a lot of these super historical questions that are unclear. And so as a reader of Hosea, you, as a modern one who we want cohesion, we want like a nice story. We're used to biographies, autobiographies. We want to figure out all the details, like what happened? Did it happen this way or that way? And it has to be one or the other. I don't mean to disappoint you. Hosea just doesn't give us that. We don't get a coherent story that we can really easily piece together, that we really know what happened between Hosea and Gomer or what. And that's not really the goal of the text. Just to remind you, these texts in Hosea, they're cyclical, not linear. So in some ways, each of those 3 chapters tell their own story, and they each have some sort of marriage parable that involves Hosea that speaks to both brokenness and renewal, and it's around marriage. But try to read them each as kind of each their own little cycle, each their own insight into what God's wanting to tell us about this marriage relationship, not as a linear thing. Each of these things that Hosea is called to, especially in chapters 1 and 3, remember in the text, these are symbolic actions. It's actually the word of the Lord came to him to go and do this. And this action is meant to symbolize and image something about God and Israel. So these are prophetic kind of symbolic actions. This text is not biography, okay? So the focus should be on what does this symbolic action symbolize, not how do I reconstruct Hosea's marriage and all its intricacies and complexities. You'll get lost if you try to do that. And also remembering this is not straight narrative. This is poetic. So if, man, I'm not sure that chapter 2 and chapter 1 align with each other, that's okay. These are like, there's a poetic thing that we're exploring an image, this metaphor of marriage between God and Israel, and that's the point, not what exactly happened, again, between Hosea and Gomer. So remember, this is what the text is, and you need to engage it on its terms. So that being said, how does the marriage metaphor, especially as we see it in those first 3 chapters, how does it work as a form of theology? How is the text doing theologizing, helping us understand God through this very complex marriage metaphor that we get kind of from different angles and episodes? All right. This is at the heart of kind of interpreting the book of Hosea, to understand how this marriage metaphor works. And here I want to kind of give us to do some theology work together. Okay. Back in the last spring, I did kind of a seminar on kind of how theology and culture engage each other, and how theology works. And I introduced a principle, what I call Scripture's pattern of divine self-revelation. When God wants to make God's self known to people, to the world, it always follows a pattern. And you can pick up almost any part of Scripture and see this pattern at work. God, who's infinite and heavenly and beyond our understanding, how in the world can God make God's self known in a way that's intelligible to us, who are embedded in a particular place in culture and have different certain concepts of understanding the world and ways of doing things? How does God bridge that gap in a way that we can come to know God? Well, the pattern of self-revelation, of how God makes God's self known in Scripture, is that God assumes, kind of steps into our world and takes up a familiar cultural form, something we know, language we use, an image we know, but then transforms it in some ways to help us to reveal God's unique self and salvation, God's good news. This is a really important principle. And if you guys remember from that seminar, I talked about, it's the very start of the Old Testament, the covenant with Abraham. Well, covenant isn't a word that dropped out of heaven. Abraham lived in this ancient world where there were these Hittite suzerain treaties, covenants, and God shows up and says, I'm going to make a covenant with you, Abraham. Well, Abraham knows what a covenant is because it's a familiar cultural form. And he knows how these things work. It's like, oh, okay, I don't know who's talking to me, but it's doing a covenant thing. And I do know that. But then God sets the terms and fulfills them in a way that's beautiful and saving, that witnesses to the uniqueness of who God is, right? So we see this pattern. It's how God makes God's self known through Jesus. How does God come to us? He assumes flesh. That's a familiar cultural form to us. It's what we live in. But then Jesus, his story is transformed. He not only dies, he rises again. And God's love is shown in Jesus in ways that you and I can't even relate to. And that reveals God's saving nature. Okay. And so we see this kind of pattern of God assuming a familiar cultural form and then transforming it. And so when you come across a metaphor, an image in Scripture, a concept, you need to do the work of how is this pattern at work, okay? And that's what we have to think about with this marriage metaphor. So first we need to know, all right, if Hosea is all about God saying, I'm gonna kind of make a marriage with you. That's what our relationship is like, a marriage. Well, you and I might have a vision of marriage that's familiar to us in the 21st century here. But that concept of marriage is not the concept of marriage they had in the ancient Near East. And so to understand what's going on in the text is we need to know what would be when God says, hey, I'm your husband, you're my spouse, this is a marriage relationship. That's how we should understand what's going on here. We need to know how they understood what marriage meant, because that's going to help us make sense of how this metaphor is functioning in the book of Hosea. And so marriage, again, then very different than marriage today. This was a patriarchal culture. Okay. It wasn't a partnership of equals where like men and women were seeking each other out, dating, and I have a job, you have a job. No. Okay. In this culture, power and authority reside with the oldest living male, and that was passed on to the eldest son. And in marriage, a wife comes into the household of the man and is under his authority. Okay. And then then her number one job is to have children who are his heir, and he passes that power and authority on down to them. All right. So marriage, the wife is subservient in this and serves the purpose of continuing the male line and supporting his power and authority. And she's under that and dependent upon it. Okay. It's also an honor-shame culture. An honor-shame culture is there's certain pieces, certain taboos in the culture that if you do them, that brings shame on you. And shame is the worst. It needs to be avoided. And what the goal for men, for women, is to have honor. And there's a different vision of what it meant to have honor as a man and honor as a woman. So it's a culture built around avoiding shame and preserving and building up honor. Okay. And part of men's honor in that culture depended upon a woman's sexual propriety and modesty. And so if a woman is sexually shameless, immodest, and is out kind of doing things, that brought shame to the husband's name. Okay. It's very important to understand, like, this wasn't quite reciprocal. Men could sleep around in a way that didn't quite bring shame to the wife or dishonor to her, because her honors rested in different things. But it was a huge deal if you're the husband, the head of the household, power and authority resides in you, and a woman, it could be your wife or your daughter or any woman connected to your household, is kind of not in line sexually. It's less about, oh my goodness, like he cheated on her. It's more of, you brought shame to our household. You've dishonored our name, and our name stands for everything here in this culture. Okay, so that was a big piece of marriage, of preserving the husband's honor, which required kind of sexual propriety on part of the wife. And because of these things, adultery, especially by the wife, was a big deal. So in a patriarchal culture, your oldest son, man, your eldest son is the most like important person, because he's the one that's going to get all the wealth, that's going to take on your name and all that stuff. And you need to know that son comes from you, right? And so if your wife has adultery, sleeps with someone else, and then she's pregnant, wait a minute, whose child is this? We don't have DNA testing back then, okay? And so this is a huge deal, right? Is this my child or your child? And my line, it could be unclear, it could be impure. I can't pass all my legacy and wealth on to a child that might have been conceived in adultery, that isn't mine. That messes up the whole patriarchal culture and how it works. And so a woman being in adultery, that messes that up. And that's a key part to the culture. And it also violates the honor codes. Like, hold on, you committed adultery. Okay, maybe again, I'm upset that you didn't sleep with me, but what's even more, you brought shame to my name and kind of ruined our family's honor. And so, especially if a woman committed adultery, the stakes were huge in a way they aren't for us today. And I'm not trying to relativize or say adultery is a good thing. I'm trying to help you understand how it functioned in that context. So the consequences were huge for adultery. One could be stoning to death, and it's hard to know if this was actually practiced. What we do know is if it was practiced, it was often only the woman, because it was much easier to verify a woman who committed adultery if like husband's like, I did not sleep with her and now she's pregnant. We all have visible evidence. It was much harder to verify if men had been sleeping around or unfaithful. And another one is kind of public humiliation. It's like, you've shamed yourself, and so we're going to kind of heap shame on you as kind of the consequence of that. So these are all familiar cultural norms around marriage in the ancient Near East that aren't things that happen to us. And the reason I'm bringing all this up is some of the language that we're going to see in the text and how it talks about marriage, what Hosea does, how God relates to Israel in this marriage. Some of it's troubling, some of it's confusing, some of it's strange. It's all playing on this cultural context. So if you're in that ancient context, you'd be like, oh, okay, I get what's going on here. I get how this metaphor is working. In a way, today, readers, it might go over our head or confuse us. All right, so we have all that context. All right, I hope you guys are with me here and tracking. So now we can start to see how these three opening chapters, episodes of marriage, ways marriage is imaged, what would be familiar? And so here's where we can start to really get into the metaphor. Episode 1, chapter 1 of Hosea. He's presented with the prospect by God of go have children with a promiscuous partner. Okay, well, if you're a typical Hebrew man who understands how marriage functions in that world, what would the normal response be? I should avoid this woman because she's going to bring shame to my household. She'd be the last person to marry. That would be the most shameful thing I could possibly do. And everything that's been trained in me is to avoid shame. And have children with her. Well, if I do, I'm going to need to reject them. They're not going to get my inheritance because I can't verify the paternity because she's been promiscuous and sleeping around. That would be the normal and kind of right and expected response of Hosea faced with that situation. In chapter 2, which again, it's like the husband's accusing the wife of the spouse's unfaithfulness. Well, what would be the normal cultural response back then? Well, my wife's been unfaithful. She needs to be punished. And we just talked about the potential punishments, consequences for that, which were severe. And even in God's own law, if you read Deuteronomy 24, if a husband's displeased with his wife, and if she's being unfaithful, that's a pretty good reason for displeasure. The husband is actually given the right to divorce or separate. So, man, my spouse unfaithful, I'm going to go get a new wife. I'm going to divorce you. Maybe there's punishment. Maybe there's stoning to death. And I'm just going to go move on from you. That would be a normal expected response of even a faithful Hebrew man in that culture. And then in episode 3, we get this other image of they seem to be already married, and you have a wife who now has somehow gone back to or is committing adultery and some form of prostitution. In that culture, if that happened, the normal expected cultural response is actually she is not allowed to return to the original husband because she is defiled. So this actually says this in the law of Moses, Deuteronomy 24. If there's a divorce and a woman goes on and she sleeps with another man, and maybe that husband dies or whatever, she can't go back to original husband. She's kind of defiled. She's unclean. You can't renew that covenant. So in all these situations, the text evokes these kind of marriage situations that people would be familiar with And they would bring into it, as they read this text, as they see Hosea doing these things, the sense of, okay, this is how we should respond in these situations. And that is the context we all need to have for understanding this metaphor, okay? So God in Hosea is trading in cultural ways of being around marriage that people are familiar with that should play out in kind of a certain way. And then God's going to take that, assumes that, kind of takes that on. Yep, this is a marriage. These are situations. And then it's going to transform and flip the script in a way that reveals something beautiful and unique about God. And that is what makes this text prophetic. It's speaking about God and a truth about God that's shocking, that's countercultural. The first thing is just the fact of, and I want you guys to get this. God's saying, hey, husbands, you guys, I'm bringing up all these situations you're familiar with. And the Hebrew males, and again, most of the priests are men. Most of the leaders, the people who are literate are men. They might be the ones who are kind of hearing these texts and receiving them firsthand. You guys are used to being the ones who hold the power of authority and dictating the consequences of unfaithfulness. And it's usually the women, the spouses who are unfaithful. And you guys are the ones that are calling the shot. You know what that's like. You guys know what that's like. Well, guess what? I'm relating to you as the husband, and you guys who are used to being the husbands with all the power and authority, you all are the unfaithful spouses whose future and consequences are completely dependent upon me. This, I want you to see, is subversive. Hosea is speaking, it's probably, again, mainly literate men who are receiving this text. And how this text is imaging them is they're all of a sudden being taken out of the place of power and authority and being put into the more dependent role and the role of the unfaithful spouse, and whose future now depends on God. And so there's something subversive of this marriage metaphor that we might not pick up on, is that God's kind of, by saying, hey, you Israelites are like an unfaithful spouse, a promiscuous spouse, he's flipping the script on them and being like, you guys are used to having the power and authority and calling the shots and doing what you want. In fact, you're unfaithful. So he's kind of pulling the rug out, and kind of, this is a wake-up call, especially to the men who are reading this text, who would be familiar with kind of marriage, but they're not used to being put in the role of, oh, I'm the spouse, I'm the unfaithful, my future's on the line, someone else is deciding the consequences for me. So there's something subversive about this marriage metaphor in that patriarchal context, by God calling Israel the unfaithful spouse. But here's the way in which the text metaphorically kind of transforms what would be culturally expected. So episode 1, go back to Hosea, right? We just looked at what would normally be expected when you're presented with the prospect of having children with a promiscuous partner. That's the cultural script that the text assumes. But then how does God call Hosea to engage in a way that transforms that script? Instead of avoiding that promiscuous partner, Hosea goes and marries the promiscuous partner. And the subtext is Hosea has to endure shame, the shame of that, for the sake of keeping covenant. And if you read chapter 1, children who are rightly called, not my people, I'm not even sure if these came from me. If you read through the chapter 1, Hosea is supposed to graciously then call them children of the living God. I'm going to treat you like my children. You are going to get my inheritance. That is not what anyone would see coming in this situation, what Hosea is called to do. In episode 2, right, we get this husband confronted with a spouse unfaithfulness. Okay, I'm going to desert her, leave her. I'm going to move on, divorce her. Well, in the text, we get a separation from Israel. But then God says, I'm going to woo you back and renew the marriage covenant and betroth you to me forever. What? That is not a script. We saw that turn coming. And then in chapter 3, already married, the wife returns to adultery and prostitution. I can't even touch you again. You're defiled. But what is Hosea called to do as a way to embody God's word to Israel? I'm purchasing back my defiled wife, and we're going to, in spite of her unfaithfulness, and we are going to be married again. So God takes a familiar cultural script and flips it in how things would work out. And the point of that is to reveal something beautiful about God's love for Israel and God's love for us. The point of this metaphor, what we're supposed to see, is in episode 1, what is this whole Hosea business, marrying promiscuous people, all the children? What is this a metaphor for? What does it speak to? What is the word of God it's telling? That God will endure the shame and guilt brought on by our unfaithfulness. He'll endure that shame and guilt to keep covenant with us. This is a countercultural God who will endure shame for the sake of relationship, where in that culture you sever relationship because of shame for the sake of honor. It's a beautiful testimony to God's love. It's a testimony that even when we throw away our spiritual birthright, God will graciously call us beloved and give us an inheritance of the divine riches. That's what this metaphor of marriage in chapter 1 is speaking to and witnessing to. In chapter 2, what does this metaphor speak to and how it plays out? That God is grieved by our covenant unfaithfulness, and God's got to address it. There's going to be consequences, but God's going to seek after us and woo us and bring us back even in our unfaithfulness. God's anger lasts a moment, but his favor lasts a lifetime. That's what this marriage metaphor is trying to reveal and speak to. And in chapter 3, what's this metaphor at? That God is faithful even when we're repeatedly unfaithful, and God can forgive that which is marked as unclean and can restore us back to wholeness in relationship with him. And so there's this beautiful, if you get all the intricacies of how marriage worked and you're familiar with it, then the things God's doing in this marriage in Hosea and what he calls Hosea to do, they're not as strange and confusing. We start to see how they're countercultural and they're revealing something unique about God's love for us. And that's what the heart of this book is about. So I want you to pay attention to that, but I also want to acknowledge, for those who don't know, October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And this is something that our church cares about deeply. We're big supporters of Hagar Sisters, which seeks to empower and free women from cycles of domestic abuse. And if you have that awareness, reading Hosea can be a difficult text. And I just want to acknowledge that and not kind of sweep that around the rug, under the rug. There's a lot of a strong male voice for God in a husband role who even is almost punishing at times, deserts the spouse in the wilderness. And that can be pretty difficult to read. And I don't want to sanitize the scriptures. I want to kind of put them out there and say, this is difficult stuff. And so this is a good, like, we're a community that encourages questions. This is a good theological question. Is this a patriarchal text that promotes violence against women, or even images God in kind of a violent way, punishing a female, like what's figured as a female? So I want to kind of sit with that text and kind of offer not an answer as much as two ways to think about that or approach that. The first is, yes, this is written in a patriarchal culture, which we just outlined. The entire Old Testament is. That was the culture back then. And so we shouldn't try to pretend there's not patriarchy in the ancient Near East. What we need to pay attention to is what I just pointed out. God's condescending to and working within and assuming a cultural form that in some ways, there's parts of it that we do not want to lift up or repeat today. and look at the ways that God is subverting that or transforming it to witness to something better and different, God's own reconciling love. So my first big point is marriage in Hosea. As we see it and see some of the ways it works, remember that marriage in Hosea, the point is when we read this stuff, it's a metaphor for God's relationship with us. That's supposed to be the takeaway, that God's going to endure shame, that God is grieved and takes seriously when we break covenant with him, and God's also going to restore us. That's the point of this marriage stuff. But how Hosea talks about marriage, it's not meant to be a manual for modern relationships, okay? Super important. Don't try to make this a manual for your marriage. Let it be a witness of God's love, and let God's love inform how you love those around you. So that's just one piece to put out there. I also just want to acknowledge, and we talk about this sometime in our church, right? A lot of the primary images for God in the Old Testament in Hosea are male images. In this text, husband and father. And that makes a lot of sense in a culture where the male head of the household is kind of the most powerful and authority figure. It makes a lot of sense that that's a metaphor we use for God. But something we've pointed out in our teaching before is Scripture often pairs in what would have been a subversive way in that context, male images of God with female images of God to help us enrich and broaden our sense of how God loves us. And so I kind of want to end by showing one of the ways in Hosea. So we get a lot of imagery of God as like this husband, a father figure in Hosea. But as you get into the end, that final circle, look at Hosea 11. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. But the more they were called, the more they went away from me. They sacrificed to the Baals. They burned incense to the images. It was I who taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by the arms. But they didn't realize it was I who healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with ties of love. To them, I was like one who lifts a little child to the cheek, and I bent down to feed them. Now, in that context, ancient context, who's doing the child rearing? It's not the dads, the males who are out running the household and being in charge of things. It's the mom, it's the women. And what a beautiful image of teaching. I taught you to walk. I carried you in my arms. I lift you like a little child. I bent down to feed you. These are what I think are maternal images of God. And so in Hosea, we get male imagery for God, female imagery, father, mother. All of this helps us understand, gives us a bigger range of metaphors, understand the greatness of God's love for us. And I'll throw out one little tidbit. It's a bit speculative. I happened to be down at my alma mater last night and staying with my friends, one of who is a remarkable, very smart Old Testament scholar, and she specializes in Hebrew poetry. And I told her I was doing a webinar on Hosea, and if she had anything for me. And this is her nugget. She said it's very uncertain in the text in verse 4 here when it says, I led them with cords of human kindness, with ties of love. Some texts say bands of love. What is it talking about? Like, what is a cord of kindness, a tie of love? And her theory, and it's as a scholar of Hebrew poetry, and this is like unverified, she's like, I still need to explore this, but she's like, this is a maternal image. Maybe this is the umbilical cord. And this beautiful image of Israel almost being tied to God in the most intimate sense, that's the cord of human kindness. I'm just throwing that out there. That is speculative. It's a theory, but it's just exploring the imagery, these rich, pregnant metaphors we get here in Hosea that have so much to say about God's love for us and what it means to respond and return to it. So, also want to give some credit. So I'm not an Old Testament scholar. My training's in theology. I just love the Bible and love studying it. So I did a lot of reading, a lot of different commentaries and articles. And just to let you know, this isn't my own, almost none of this is my own thoughts. This is me learning from a community of scholars, a diverse community of scholars. And so these are some of the people that I drew from. So just I want you to know and acknowledge that. So that's it, man. That is it. So I don't know if anyone has any questions or things they want to discuss as we wrap up. Thanks for listening and engaging here. It was good to have you guys here. Any questions, things to discuss? Well, all right. No one's bringing anything up. I'm glad you guys could join on. So my hope tonight is that this gave you kind of some inroads to the book of Hosea, some handholds. And as we go through this sermon series, as you read it, it feels less of a strange text and more of one that you feel like you can navigate and get meaning from that makes sense. And I just hope we can all kind of grow in readers of scripture. And feel free to come up with me through the series, ask me questions. I love to learn about this stuff and keep growing in my knowledge. So thank you guys, and hope to see you guys in church.
Thank you, Will.